10 disturbing experiments conducted on humans. Prisoners, those with disabilities, people who are physically or mentally ill, and the impoverished were all traditionally seen to be acceptable research subjects. And you were free to conduct your tests on people who weren't eager to participate, or weren't even aware that they were doing so if you didn't want to obtain permission. Informed consent is now necessary for any government-funded medical study involving human participants, as a result of rules altered by the United States Congress 40 years ago. However, prior to 1974, the ethics surrounding the use of humans in research experiments were, shall we say, a little lax. And it was frequently upsetting when human subjects were used for profit or were abused. Our list starts with one of the most well-known examples of exploitation, a study that finally contributed to changing the public's perception of exploitation done without consent in the name of science. 10. Tuskegee Syphilis Study. In 1928, the Julius Rosenwald Fund, a charitable organization, started a public healthcare program in the American rural South in response to the syphilis epidemic that plagued the country in the 1920s. Looks good, doesn't it? It was, until the project lost its funding in 1929 when the United States was hit by the Great Depression. The program was altered. In 1932, underprivileged black men in Macon County, Alabama, were enrolled in a program to treat what was referred to as their bad blood, a term that, at the time, was used to refer to everything from anemia to fatigue to syphilis. They received free food, lodging, and other perks including funeral insurance in exchange for their participation in the study. But they were unaware that it was all a lie. The men in the study were not informed that they were participating in the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male, a government experiment studying untreated syphilis, or that they had been selected for the program despite having the sexually transmitted disease syphilis. Untreated, that's correct, subjects never actually received the necessary treatment for the ailment, despite believing they were receiving care. This continued even after rapid treatment centers were established in 1947 and penicillin became the standard therapy for the infection in 1945. Tuskegee Syphilis Project ethical questions were first raised in 1936, but the project wasn't really terminated until 1972 as a result of widespread public outcry following media coverage of the multi-decade experiment. 9. The Nazi medical experiments. Adults and children held in the concentration camps of Dachau, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen underwent medical experiments during World War II. The descriptions of cruelty, dismemberment, starvation, and torture read like a gruesome compendium of the 9 degrees of hell. Under the pretense of military advancement, medical and pharmaceutical advancement, and racial and population advancement, prisoners in these death camps were subjected to horrendous crimes. Jews were the subjects of military experiments, such as hypothermia research in which prisoners were submerged in icy water to determine how long a downed pilot could survive under the same circumstances. In a study to see how long pilots might survive at sea, some victims were given access to nothing but sea water. Unsurprisingly, these participants perished from dehydration. In order to research high-altitude sickness and how changes in atmospheric pressure would affect pilots, victims were also subjected to high altitude in decompression chambers, frequently followed by brain dissection on the living. The Nazis were also interested in effectively treating battle wounds, therefore drug research took place in these concentration camps. As a novel treatment for battle injuries, sulfanilamide was investigated. Inflicted wounds on the victims were then purposefully infected. On human subjects, infections and poisonings were also researched. Prisoners were given TB injections in an effort to learn more about how to immunize against the virus. Poison tests to see how quickly victims would pass away were also planned. The Nazis also carried out artificial inseminations, sterilizations motivated by race or genetics, and experiments on twins and people with short stature. 8. Watson's Little Albert experiment. At Johns Hopkins University, in 1920, John Watson and graduate student Rosalie Rayner conducted an emotional conditioning experiment on a 9-month-old infant they dubbed Albert B, in an effort to support their theory that all people are born with blank slates that may be shaped. The mother of the child, a wet nurse employed by the hospital, received $1 for letting her son participate. In the Little Albert experiment, the baby was first exposed to a little white fuzzy rat, which he originally showed no fear of. He reportedly didn't appear to be all that interested. Then, as a big noise erupted, they reintroduced him to the rat. Albert was repeatedly exposed to the rat and startling noises until he developed a fear of all small, fuzzy animals, including dogs and monkeys in addition to rats, regardless of volume. Up until 2010, no one knew who exactly Albert was. However, in 2010, Douglas Merritt's identity was made public. Merritt turned out to be a problematic subject. He displayed evidence of behavioral and neurological damage, was unable to walk or talk, and only lived to the age of 6 before passing away from hydrocephalus, water on the brain. He also had bacterial meningitis, which he might have contracted unintentionally while receiving therapy for his hydrocephalus or, horrifyingly, purposely as part of another experiment. Merritt was never deconditioned, and since he passed away at such a young age, no one knows if his fear of little furry creatures persisted after the trial. 7. The Monster Study of 1939. Today, we know that there are numerous potential causes for stuttering. It might be a hereditary genetic anomaly of the language center of the brain that runs in some families. Additionally, a brain damage, such as a stroke or other trauma, may induce it. Some young kids stutter as they begin to speak, but they get over it. Rarely, it could be a complication of emotional trauma. But do you know what it isn't brought on by? Criticism. In an effort to show that stuttering is a learned behavior, Mary Tudor, a graduate student at the University of Iowa, and Wendell Johnson, a professor and expert in the field of speech, set out in 1939. A stuttering experiment was actually conducted on 22 orphan children over the course of 4 months. Only about half of them were stutterers, and none of them received speech therapy. During the experiment, the children were split into 4 groups. Half of the stutterers were given negative feedback. The other half of stutterers were given positive feedback. Half of the non-stuttering group were all told they were beginning to stutter and were criticized. The other half of non-stutterers were praised. The third group of children was the only one that experienced any meaningful effects from the experiment. Even if they never actually stutter, they started to behave differently, displaying low self-esteem and taking on the self-conscious traits of stutterers. Those that did stutter continued to do so despite the criticism they received. 6. Stateville Penitentiary Malaria Study. According to estimates, 60 to 65% of American soldiers serving in the South Pacific during World War II experienced malaria at some point during their deployment. Finding a successful treatment was of utmost importance since for some troops the virus proved to be more lethal than the enemy forces. Safe anti-malarial medications were considered crucial to winning the battle. More than 400 inmates at the Stateville Penitentiary in Illinois participated in an experiment to discover a malaria medicine that worked beginning in 1944 and lasting for 2 years. Malaria-infected prisoners who were participating in the experiment were then given experimental anti-malarial medications. The American public, which was unified in defeating World War II and anxious to return the troops home in good condition, didn't seem to be bothered by the experiment's lack of a concealed agenda or its immoral technique. The participants, who were at the time commended for their patriotism and in many cases offered lighter prison sentences in exchange for their participation, were aware of the experiment's purpose. 5. The Aversion Project in South Africa. You experienced racial segregation that was governed by the state if you lived in South Africa during the apartheid era. If that wasn't challenging enough, the state also had influence over your sexual orientation. Strict anti-homosexual legislation was upheld by the South African government. In addition to being viewed as a deviant if you were gay, your homosexuality was also seen as a condition that could be managed. Psychiatrists and army medical personnel in the South African Defence Force, SADF, continued to adhere to the antiquated beliefs and treatments, even after homosexuality was no longer regarded as a mental disease and aversion therapy as a treatment for it had been disproved. Aversion therapy tactics were particularly applied to prisoners and South Africans who were compelled to enlist in the military under the period's conscription rules. In Ward 22 at one military hospital in Voortrekkerhout, Pretoria, attempts were made to cure deemed deviants between 1969 and 1987. During electroconvulsive behavior treatment, homosexuals, gay men, and lesbians were given drugs and exposed to aversion stimuli, same-sex erotic photos, which were then followed with sensual images of the opposite sex following the electric shock. The victims were subsequently treated with hormone treatment, which in some cases involved chemical castration, when the method didn't work, and it clearly didn't. In addition, when further attempts to reorient them failed, an estimated 900 men and women also underwent gender reassignment surgery, most without consent, and some was left unfinished. 4. Milgram shock experiments. It's possible that social psychologist Stanley Milgram's well-known set of shock experiments from the early 1960s served as inspiration for Ghostbuster Peter Venkman, who is seen in the fictional movie conducting ESP electroshock studies on college students. American volunteers for a Yale study that they believed was about memory and learning were instructed to act as teachers in Milgram's studies, reading lists of words to learners, actors, although the instructors were unaware of this. Each person playing the part of the teacher was given instructions to depress a lever that would shock their learner each time he failed a word-matching quiz. About 2/3 of the teachers shocked students at the greatest possible voltage, continuing to administer jolts as directed by the experimenter. Teachers believed that the voltage of shocks increased with each mistake and ranged from 15 to 450 possible volts. In actuality, this wasn't a test of memory or learning, but rather of our willingness to submit to authority. Actually, no shocks were delivered. Milgram's shock studies are still debatable today, although some criticize them for lacking realism, others point to the findings as crucial to understanding how people act when they are under pressure. The findings of Milgram's study were confirmed in 2010, with almost 70% of teachers obediently giving their students what they thought to be the greatest voltage shocks. 3. CIA mind control experiments, Project MKUltra. If you've seen Men Who Stare at Goats or The Manchurian Candidate, you're aware that the CIA has conducted secret mind control studies in the past. If you assumed it to be fiction, you were mistaken. The CIA began looking into ways to transform Americans into CIA-controlled super agents, people who could carry out murders and who wouldn't be impacted by enemy interrogations, during the Cold War. As part of the MKUltra project, the CIA experimented on unwitting American and Canadian citizens by giving them psychedelic drugs like LSD, PCP, and barbiturates, as well as other illegal techniques like hypnosis, potentially chemical, biological, and radiological agents. Universities collaborated without their awareness, primarily as a delivery system. According to the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, 7,000 troops are believed to have participated in the study against their will. Over the course of the project's more than 20-year lifespan, the agency invested around $20 million. Although further deaths were suspected, only one was directly linked to the project, and the CIA destroyed all papers related to it in 1973. 2. Unit 731. The Geneva Protocol forbade the use of biological weapons in 1925, but Japan disagreed. Military authorities reasoned that germ warfare must be effective if it was effective enough to be outlawed. In Japanese-controlled Manchuria, Unit 731, a covert unit in a secret facility, was established. By the middle of the 1930s, Japan had started experimenting with pathogenic and chemical warfare and testing on human subjects there. In order to better understand how various infectious diseases affected the human body and how they may be employed in bombs and attacks during World War II, military doctors and officials there purposefully exposed victims to diseases including anthrax, bubonic plague, cholera, syphilis, typhus, and other pathogens. Along with working with diseases, Unit 731 also performed human experiments, such as vivisections and dissections on living subjects, all without anesthesia. The experimenters thought employing it would distort the results of the research. In general, everyone who wasn't Japanese was a possible subject. Many of the subjects were Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, but they also included Russian and American victims among others. The number of fatalities inside the facility is currently estimated at around 100,000, but when you take into account the germ warfare field experiments, such as reports of Japanese planes dropping plague-infected fleas over Chinese villages and poisoning wells with cholera, the number rises to estimates closer to 250,000, possibly even higher. Unbelievably, as part of an intelligence exchange deal, the United States granted protection to those responsible for the war crimes perpetrated at Unit 731 after World War II. Up until the 1980s, the Japanese government refused to acknowledge that any of this ever took place. 1. The human vivisections of Herophilus. Herophilus practiced medicine in Alexandria. Herophilus, an ancient physician, is regarded as the inventor of anatomy. Although he produced important discoveries throughout the course of his practice, his understanding of the inner workings of the human body is what puts him on our list. Egypt's first two Ptolemaic pharaohs granted him permission to publicly dissect human remains, which he performed for at least 30 to 40 years with the Greek physician and anatomist Erasistratus. Criminals may be punished with dissection and vivisection under Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II, and it is believed that the father of anatomy performed vivisection on 600 or so estimated living inmates in addition to doing dissection on the dead. Herophilus made significant advancements in the study of human anatomy, particularly the brain, eyes, liver, circulatory system, nervous system, and reproductive system, at a time when dissecting human corpses was regarded as a form of bodily desecration, although autopsies on the dead were not practiced at the time due to the widespread use of mummification in Egypt. Additionally, just like now, vivisection of living subjects was seen as butchery. Thank you again for joining us for another video. If you liked the video, please like, subscribe and comment down below and let us know what you would like to hear in the near future. See you all again soon.